I know it sounds strange, but our story begins with nothing. Not complete! Nothing, mind you, because that doesn't exist, but a lack of something, a void where a sensation should have been. You see, Thomas Gray was bored. It wasn't a sudden thing. It hadn't been caused by a particular occurrence. Rather, it was a slow-burning realization that had been growing within him like a weed between the stones of his life. Every morning he woke up and did his chores. Every afternoon he worked. And every evening he ate and slept. And with each sunrise and sunset, the weed grew a little taller, blocking the sun and casting a shadow over his existence. It wasn't all bad. Mind you, he was healthy, had a roof over his head, and food in his belly. But that was the problem. Everything was just as it always had been, and it was that sameness that gnawed at him like a persistent doubt, like a whisper in the silence of his life. It was as if he were a piece of cloth on a weaver's loom, moving back and forth across the same pattern, creating a tapestry of monotony. And so he began to look around, searching for a change. For anything to break the predictable weave of his days. He started small, rearranging the furniture in his cottage. But it soon became clear that even this small shift could not alter the fundamental sameness of his life. Then he tried something new, a different route to the well, a different path through the fields. But wherever he went, the same sights met his eyes, and the same thoughts filled his mind. And he realized with a sinking heart that he was not merely walking in space, but also in time, trapped in an endless loop of recurring days. One day, while working on a farm outside the village, he noticed a distant hill, its peak shrouded in mist. Something about it, perhaps its very indistinctness, sparked a thought in him. Had he ever climbed that hill? He couldn't recall. Did it matter? No, of course not. But still, the thought lingered like a half-remembered dream. And as weeks passed, the idea of climbing the hill grew in his mind like a seed taking root. Then one Saturday, when the thought of another uneventful day in the village was too much to bear, Thomas decided to act. He told the farmer he was needed elsewhere, packed a simple lunch, and set off toward the hill. The walk was longer than he had anticipated. The road, if it could be called that, was rough and uneven, and the hill seemed to stretch before him endlessly. But with each step, the familiar landscape receded, and the unknown beckoned. And though fear tugged at his heart, the prospect of the new outweighed the comfort of the known. At last, after what felt like hours, but was probably no more than a couple of hours, he reached the top. And when he looked around, he realized he had never truly seen the countryside before. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills, valleys, and distant farmhouses, all bathed in the golden light of the afternoon sun. It was as if he had climbed not just a hill, but out of his life, leaving behind not just the trees and houses of the village, but also the routine and sameness that had become his prison. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Thomas sat down on a nearby rock and ate his lunch. It was cold and not particularly appetizing, but it tasted better to him than the finest feast. For it was not the food that sustained him, but the hope that bloomed in his chest, fragile yet tenacious, like a wildflower pushing through a crack in the pavement. He knew he could return to the village, to his old life, but something had shifted within him. The climb had awakened something new, a spark of courage, a thirst for exploration. And as he stood there watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized he didn't want to go back. When Thomas returned to the village, it was as if he had come back from a faraway land. Not just because of the dirt on his clothes and the wind in his hair, but because of the change in his eyes, the stories they now held, the hint of a smile that lingered on his lips. The villagers noticed, of course, for how could they not? But they didn't understand. They saw a man returning to his humdrum existence, and they couldn't comprehend why he would do such a thing. They continued with their lives, tending to their fields, repairing their roofs, eating their meals, and repeating their words. But Thomas was changed. The hill had shown him that there was more to the world than the village, that there were wonders and adventures beyond the horizon, and that he, Thomas Gray, was capable of experiencing them. But how could he do that without disrupting the fabric of his life? The life that everyone, including him, had always known. How could he break the mold without breaking himself? The answer, as it often does, lay in the small things. He began by changing his routines slightly, rising a little earlier, walking a different path to the well, trying a new vegetable in his garden. He didn't make drastic changes, for he knew the value of stability, but he added variety. And that variety became his solace, his connection to the world beyond the village. Then he started saving money. Not for some grand adventure, but for small treats, a new book, a length of fine cloth for his wife, a jar of preserved plums. These things were not necessities, but they brought him joy, a distraction from the sameness that threatened to engulf him. And as the years passed, Thomas continued to explore the world around him, visiting neighboring towns, talking to travelers, listening to their tales of distant lands. He learned that the world was vast and full of wonders, and he basked in that knowledge, letting it nourish his spirit. But perhaps the most important change Thomas made was in himself. He started paying attention to the small details, the shape of a cloud, the sound of a bird, the smell of rain on parched earth. He began to appreciate the beauty in the everyday, the wonder in the ordinary, and his life took on a new depth. The villagers noticed, of course, that something was different about Thomas Gray, but they couldn't put their finger on it. They saw a man who had found contentment in his simple life. A man who had overcome the challenges of existence and emerged, not just unbroken, but whole. They didn't understand that Thomas had found a way to live a life of quiet adventure. That he had discovered the thrill of exploration, not in physical journeys, but in the richness of experience. They continued with their lives, tending to their fields, repairing their roofs, eating their meals, and repeating their words. But Thomas was content, for he had learned that the greatest adventures are not always in faraway lands, but sometimes in the small, brave steps we take to enrich our everyday lives.